Good afternoon. I'm Karen Donfried, the president of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this conversation about transatlantic relations with two giants in that field. I just want to let you all know that other than the audience in these two rooms, we are live streaming this event, so we have an audience on the video screen as well. And for those of you who like social media, you are welcome to tweet. Our hashtag is GMFEurope. And with that, I am tempted to introduce at length both of our guests this afternoon. I will not do that. You have their full bios on the invitation. And in many ways, I think both of them do not need an introduction because they're such well-known figures to all of us at this event. We have Madeleine Albright, who has many high points in her career, but I think most of us think of her as Madam Secretary. And we have President Vīķe-Freiberga, who led her country of Latvia during a significant time and continues to contribute in many ways. And we were just so delighted to bring them together for this conversation today. And the way we want to run this is I'm first going to engage in a conversation with them, which is a personal privilege for me, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. And what I thought I would do is start with that broad topic of the state of transatlantic relations. I travel to Europe a lot and often hear from Europeans, you Americans, it feels like you don't care that much about Europe anymore. Your president announced the pivot to Asia. Are you still committed to the transatlantic partnership? And so Secretary Albright, I wanted to start by asking you that question.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hosting this, and it's wonderful to be with my friend and all of you here. I believe it is an essential relationship, and the one that is the basis of obviously a lot of things we did in the 20th century, but clearly the 21st, and the most important relationship that exists. Is it perfect? No. I think that part of the thing that has happened is that it is my belief that the United States wanted and expected to have a complete partnership with Europe, that it would be understood and would be the basis of many things that we did. We have more in common than with anybody else, and that it would be the foundation of being able to do things in other parts of the world. It was the basis. I think also there has been, if I might say, some disappointment, because there were a lot of people who wondered whether the U.S. supported a strong EU. I believe the U.S. did support and wanted a strong EU, and as the EU got kind of more disintegrated in some ways and was not performing that role of partner, I think that that is one of the things that brings the question up. The issue, first of all, the United States is not monogamous. We are an Atlantic and a Pacific power. And I think just because there really is a sense that we have rebalanced to Asia does not mean that we're not interested in Europe. I do get asked all the time, especially by my Central European friends, who got an awful lot of attention in the latter part of the 20th century. You don't love us anymore. And I say, you know something, you used to be the problem, and now we see you as the solution. And we see this as an ongoing relationship. But I think it has gotten more and more complex. I think I'm sure we'll spend a lot of time talking about it, but I do think it continues to be the basis of what the 21st century international system looks like.
Mm-hmm. President Vīķe-Freiberga, how does that resonate with you sitting in Riga?
Well, friendships of any kind, both personal and between nations, are fragile flowers. They have to be cultivated. And I think the transatlantic relationship is one that deserves and needs to be continuously cultivated on both sides. If you start neglecting it, if the partners feel that there's lack of interest on the other side or not sufficient as in the case of security in Europe, when the Americans have told us quite clearly and deservedly that Europe is not pulling its weight in terms of its own security. Well, of course, then one has to work at it. But I thought, ladies and gentlemen, I should really tell you about the influence of America in the world. Is that maybe about my first meeting with this distinguished lady. It happened in Sarajevo, where President Clinton had called a very large conference of, I don't know how many countries at the time, 60 or so, heads of state, all there with their delegations. And when you are at these international meetings, just as at the United Nations, you can see America coming at a distance. It's sort of like a flotilla of assistants around the president, a swarm of bodyguards, and they sort of float like an icebreaker through the crowds, and you can't miss them. And there's all this swarm of men in dark suits, and I see this vision coming, facing me, a slight lady in a bright canary yellow suit. And since I myself was wearing a rather bright coat dress, our eyes met, and she smiled at me. And that smile warmed my heart, and I've been her fan ever since. And I think that friendships of that sort between persons and friendships between continents and between countries are built on mutual trust, on the feeling of having something in common. In a sense of mutual sympathy, there has to be an affirmation. It's like women frequently complain to their husbands, do you love me? Or you don't tell me that you love me so sufficiently often enough. And I think countries also have to tell each other that, yes, they care for each other.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that if we were able to send Secretary Albright to Europe more often in a canary yellow suit or any color suit, it would be a good thing for the transatlantic relationship. But you also touched on the point that you said security in Europe, it's a fair criticism that maybe Europe isn't pulling its weight. And of course, we have a very complex security situation in Europe today. And certainly the two of you, in the various roles that you've played, have made significant contributions to this goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And you could argue that that post-Cold War security order ended last year when President Putin decided that Russia would illegally annex Crimea, and certainly we've seen it in the ongoing tumult in eastern Ukraine. And I'd like to draw you both out on the security situation we face in Europe today. Do you think that the transatlantic community, the US, the European Union, NATO, are pursuing the right policies with regard to Ukraine? And if not, what would be the course corrections that you would encourage? Maybe we'll start first with you, President Vīķe-Freiberga.
I have sat on several panels or high-level groups about security. Currently, one from the OECD, which is still in progress, and previously one that Javier Solana, the former Secretary General of NATO, was heading, and that report is available in the public domain. And the conclusion about European security is that Europeans don't even need to spend more than they do at the moment on their defense, if only they could do so in a more coherent and coordinated manner. If they could have some sense of avoiding overlap, instead of having 15 different types of tanks manufactured in different countries, to sort of agree on allowing one country to be the champion for that and somebody else to do the ordnance and that sort of thing. The difference between the States and Europe is that your chain of command is much, much shorter than it is in Europe and in NATO. And that is a complication. But Europe, of course, is attached to this the individual differences of its member states. And hopefully we will preserve that respect for different nations and their desire to be independent nations, regardless of their size. We have small, medium, and we have large, and we have tiny countries in Europe, and they all have an equal voice when it comes. When Latvia and Lithuania sit with Luxembourg, they all three L's have each a vote in the decisions of the European Council. The concern about security, I think, in Europe had been for a long time. Certainly the European left had agitated for the, as it were, lack of necessity for more security ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. They were saying, well, the Cold War is over, therefore Europe is now already at peace. We do not foresee any problems. We want to trade with Russia. We are buying fossil fuels from them, and our companies are making huge investments in that country. And therefore we can look forward to a bright future of happy collaboration. And of course nobody could argue against that, except those of us who have historically rather sad experiences of not being prepared in terms of our security. Latvia was a neutral country between the two world wars, and was in fact invaded by the Soviet Union under the accusation that they were plotting, if you please, to have a military alliance with Estonia and Lithuania, as if that could have ever posed a threat to the Soviet Union. As today, Mr. Putin will occasionally say that NATO came dangerously close to Russian borders when the Baltic countries were admitted, when in point of fact Poland had been a member earlier and of course has a border with Russia. So that the arguments, it's curious how the arguments keep getting repeated. Europe has woken up now. Mr. Putin has woken up, even those in Europe who felt that it has no need of security. The events in Syria have been a wake-up call. The flood of refugees has been a wake-up call. But the ability to work in a more concerted effort, this is still before us, because each country has its champions in terms of the military-industrial complex and so on and so forth. So Europe has quite a challenge in front of it. But the necessity of collaborating with the United States as far as European security goes, I think just about everybody recognizes that, unfortunately, we do have to rely on our partners across the ocean, that even with under the best of circumstances, it would be difficult for Europe to stand alone. It might someday do it, but not in the foreseeable future. And the transatlantic link in terms of security is particularly important, but why not the transatlantic link in everything else?
Mm-hmm. Secretary Albright, Ukraine faces enormous economic, political, military challenges. Do you think we in the transatlantic community are on the right path in our support for Ukraine? Do we need to do more?
Well, the short answer is I think we need to do more. Let me kind of also go back a little bit through the history of this. I do think that it is a given, the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. I think especially for some of us of a certain age, in terms of really understanding the basis of it. But it has gone through some ups and downs. There has been a little bit of a, doesn't look like a fair balance. I mean, this is called the German Marshall Plan because the Marshall Plan had in fact provided for the resurrection of Europe and the creation of NATO as a way of showing our bona fides in terms of being committed to each other's security, and support for the European Union that grew out of the Marshall Plan, the coal community, a variety of things. There has been kind of a trend here. I think what has been interesting, and you started out by saying that we were committed to a Europe whole and free. This was something that came at the end of the Cold War, first said by the first President Bush, that really made a lot of sense. Of countries that had, against their will, been part of the Soviet satellite system, who now wanted to be part of a Europe whole and free. This was not something that was an American idea and imposed on them. I had a fascinating time in '91 and did surveys all over Europe, and what the Central and Eastern Europeans and in the Baltics were saying, we're Europeans, we want to be Europeans. And the United States policy in the 90s was really to follow through on what the first President Bush had said and create more and more relationships, including the expansion of NATO. And the Partnership for Peace, which was a way to begin the knitting process. Ukraine is a very special country. I think that what we forget is how large it is, and that there are 45 million people in a very large area in a very difficult place. They are between Russia and the rest of Europe. Most countries do not change their geographical location. The Soviet Union did, because it gave up, or was, actually they lost. I think the big mistake we all kept saying is we won the Cold War, they lost the Cold War. And so this division happens, and Ukraine, a country that had nuclear weapons, that had been the birthplace of Russia, very complex place, but does want to be a part of Europe. I believe that, I know many people here have been to Kiev many times. I went there to observe the elections as chairman of NDI and went to the Maidan. These are people that stood up there and made clear where they wanted to belong. I think most unfortunately, the leadership of Ukraine had let down the people of Ukraine after the Orange Revolution, and they now wanted to be part of this. And my sense is that we are not doing enough. President Poroshenko, I just saw in New York, he had a discussion with President Clinton at CGI, and they want more help. They are prepared to do an awful lot in terms of their economic reform, but the economic reform and security go together. And I believe that people have a right to defend themselves. Now, we all have our own backgrounds. I was born in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was sold down the river. And if I look at what is happening in many ways in Ukraine, I think we need to help them more economically and be able to make the Russians live up to the Minsk Accords. And when they have phony elections, call it the way it is, because I think that we owe it to them and to all of us who believe in a Europe whole and free.
And I want to stay with you for a minute, because all of what's happening in Ukraine, of course, has put in place fundamental questions about what our policy toward Russia should be. This week began with President Obama meeting with President Putin. That seemed to air a lot of disagreement and lack of a shared vision, not just on Ukraine, also on Syria, but there's a lot of discussion about how should we be engaging Russia. You know, on the one hand, we've cooperated with Russia in getting chemical weapons out of Syria. We've cooperated with Russia in the P5+1 context on Iran. What is your wisdom on how, you can speak to the US, and President Vīķe-Freiberga, you can speak to Europe, how do we navigate this new policy toward Russia?
Well, let me just go back a little bit also. I do think that, I think we have to admit that we aren't very good at understanding Russia. And there are those that of us, I mean, people would say to me, well, you're Czech, so you're prejudiced. That there are people that are anti-Russian by birth or whatever. The bottom line is, I do think that it is fascinating I used to be known as a Soviet expert. I look at my library and I thought archaeology, not exactly. And I think it is worth kind of thinking about what has gone on. But specifically, in the 90s, I was there, and but first at the UN and then as secretary. What we wanted so badly was to treat Russia in a way as if they could be a part of an international system. There were allegations now that we didn't treat them with respect. Please. the amount of time that some of us spent treating them with respect was overboard in terms of the number of time. People know the history of it. But so the Russians have now made up their own version of history. NATO was never against, in the post-Cold War period, against them. I personally spent time with President Yeltsin saying to him, at some point, if you want to, you can be members of NATO. This NATO is not against you. And I do think that they have now invented their own version of history. Now, the reason to go through all this is what is troubling as we look at what is going on now. We are dealing with a leader who, in fact, has made up his own facts. And I think that we have to be very careful about that in terms of that the Ukrainians, that they never, that the Ukrainians asked them in, or that the Malaysian plane just fell out of the air, or whatever it is, they have made up their own version. They are making up their own version of what is going on in Syria at the moment. Now because we do feel a responsibility to somehow govern the international system, also, and are eternal optimists, are trying to figure out a way to be tough on the Russians as far as Ukraine is concerned, and be open to the possibility of some kind of cooperation on another problem, such as the chemical weapons, and now in terms of what is going on in Syria. I think we were let down today when the Russians are in there bombing some of the sites of the rebels. So I think the question is, how do we bring Russia in? Because I think isolating them doesn't prove anything. I mean, they're too big to be isolated, but try to figure out how to make clear our displeasure about them undermining the post-Cold War international system, and at the same time trying not to isolate them completely. And let me just say, I talked about this survey that I was involved in '91. We did focus groups all over. One was in Russia, and I will never forget this. This man stands up and says, "I'm so embarrassed. We used to be a superpower, and now we're Bangladesh with missiles." And what has happened is that Putin has he is now picturing himself of returning Russia's glory, and an awful lot of this has to do with psychology and identity.
And President Vīķe-Freiberga, you have lots of experience in working with Russia. What is your sense about the right balance between isolation and engagement, and how we move forward?
You can't isolate a country as large as Russia, obviously, even for practical reasons. We, as their immediate neighbors, we have cooperation, for instance, in our border posts, clearly. And one would only hope that the international community would be allowed to do the same and inspect the borders between Russia and Ukraine. It would help an awful lot if that were the case. But yes, I think Secretary Albright has pointed out to an aspect of Russian psychology that is absolutely crucial in understanding their attitude towards the world. All through the rise of communism and the Second World War, Stalin, who did immense, unimaginable harm to his own people, managed to have a propaganda apparatus that said it's all worthwhile, it's for the glory of Russia and it's for the glory of the revolution, and we are going to transform the world, and you are the missionaries who are going to have the merit of making the world a better place. And even though people were starving and living in extremely difficult situations, they would accept the sacrifice with that feeling of moral superiority. At the same time, of course, there's a country that never has had really a free democracy, does not have democratic transitions. The traditions in that transition period from the Soviet authoritarian system to the current one they have now. And President Yeltsin's period was too brief and too chaotic to have brought in any substantial changes in that regard. I think the average Russian citizen is looking for a strong leader, and they got one. Then they have a completely controlled press. The media are under complete control. They're as much under control as they were in Soviet times. And the media constantly do give a completely new version of history, according to which Russia, which is a great country and the sole center of decent civilization left in the world, because the West is corrupt and degenerate and doesn't have any proper values anymore. Russia and the Orthodox Church are the hope of the world, and whereas it used to be communism, now it's the Russian ideals and values, of which it's unclear what exactly they might be, whereas the values that the West, of course, subscribes to, such as the rule of law, the equality of people before the law, transparency, diversity, and freedom of the media, all those are not being respected there. And he's rewriting history. I mean, they're actually shipping history books into Latvia, for instance, to the Russian-speaking population, picturing Russia as a poor little orphan that is being attacked by everybody unfairly, especially by the nasty United States. And it's sort of the sort of propaganda you would expect in wartime. And what is happening in Ukraine, of course, well, there is essentially there is a war, and there seems to be the kind of propaganda going on that makes citizens feel under attack, under unfair sort of treatment. They have to, there's a revanchism, you see, they have to sort of to avenge themselves of the wrongs that have been done to them. They have a perfect right to do so, and they certainly have a perfect right to determine all the countries, that cordon sanitaire, that belt, that sanitary belt that goes around the rim of what is now the Russian Federation, that Russia has an inborn sovereign right to determine their choices in terms of their own security and their form of governance. And this is something that is totally against, well, for one thing, the United Nations and its principles. The United Nations was, after all, founded on the idea of the sovereign rights of nations to be represented, be it Kiribati and Nauru and the United States and Russia. Countries large and small being there, and each having their own choice as to how they wish to live their lives. And to me, that is the most dangerous aspect of the Russian policy, is this insistence that the world should acknowledge that they have certain privileges. And it was very ironic that this spring at the Munich Security Conference, Foreign Minister Lavrov made a speech where he, in a manner I found rather offensive, he quoted Orwell's Animal Farm by saying that all animals are created equal and some more equal than others, and then went on to give a long litany of the wrongs that the United States had committed in the last 20 years, and pictured Russia as a poor victim of this very aggressive and domineering behavior. And frankly, I have come to the point where when Mr. Putin makes an announcement and complains about somebody in the world doing something to them, to me, that is a signal that is precisely what he is actually doing or planning to do. It is sad, but the only way to treat a person like that is to be strong enough not to let them walk all over you. You must talk to them, you must engage them, of course. But I think if you allow a person like that, it's like a wife beater in a family whom you tolerate and say, well, that's the kind of mood he is, and his wife made him angry, the soup wasn't warm enough or something. There's always a reason why you have to be aggressive. But one shouldn't accept that. It's not acceptable, and therefore one should draw red lines and lines in the sand. And be strong enough to maintain them, because I think they are going to push as far as they can get. They have done that in the last years or so. They will continue to do that, and there is need for a pushback. Hopefully not a major confrontation. Hopefully, my heavens, I, as a child who grew up during the war and in post-war Germany as a refugee, certainly those of us who remember the war, that's the last thing we'd like to see happen again, but they're having it in Ukraine against their will. We should be prepared to ensure that, well, more countries are not invaded like Georgia was or like Ukraine was, because the danger is that they might do that in the future.
I think the only positive thing out of this, if you can think about it, is, and I was saying the U.S. was somewhat disappointed in some of the things that had been happening in Europe and division, et cetera. I do think that this has united the alliance. That is not what Putin had in mind. His point was that he wanted to divide the alliance. And the statements that have been made in a variety of the sessions of NATO have shown a real unity. There may be some discrepancy in terms of percentages of GDP for defense, but there really is this sense of unity. I don't think he had this in mind. I do think that we need to understand that. But a point that I just would like to go back to is it was a privilege to be in office in the 90s. It was the most amazing period at the end of the Cold War. And I was at the UN at the beginning, and what was interesting was to watch somebody like Ambassador Vorontsov, who had been up there representing the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden it was the Russian Federation, and trying how he was adjusting. Lavrov was the perm rep when I was there. There were days he was nice and days that he wasn't, but he was into that also. And I was in Munich too. It was the most outrageous thing I've ever seen. And the question, and I honestly, I keep going over this. Did we do something wrong in the 90s? I think on the contrary, what we were trying to do was to figure out how to bring this country, and all of us that were Soviet experts have a love-hate relationship with Russia. I speak Russian, I love reading Russian. It's a fascinating country to study and try to analyze, and we really, really tried. And for them to be now blaming us for everything, what Putin needs is an enemy, and he will always find an enemy if he's looking for it. And I do think that it's going to be worth a lot of dissertations and papers to look at the 90s, but believe me, we really tried to treat Russia with respect and bring it into the system as if it could, in fact, help in governing a very complex world.
Right. I'm going to put one more topic on the table before I open it up to all of you. And I want to pick up on the point you just made, which is that in some cases, crises can unite. And arguably, Ukraine has done that in the transatlantic relationship. But we seem to be having this simultaneity of crises, and there's another crisis, the migration refugee crisis, that seems to be actually having the opposite effect and showing deep division, certainly within Europe. And as I was preparing for this and thinking about both of your backgrounds, it's quite striking that you were both born in countries that you did not grow up in. Your families chose or were forced to leave the countries that you each were born in. And that's been to the great benefit of the United States in the case of Secretary Albright. And of course, Latvia had the huge benefit of having President Vīķe-Freiberga return to Latvia. So you have a particular perspective on the refugee issue. And maybe I'll start first with you, President Vīķe-Freiberga. I mean, I think for those of us sitting on this side of the Atlantic, it is striking how this migration refugee crisis has surfaced divisions in Europe that seem much deeper and more profound than what we've seen during the Eurozone crisis. It's touching on issues of culture and identity. And I wonder if you could help us understand how and why this is playing out the way it is in Europe.
I think it's extremely simple. It's the size, the sheer size of the mass of people wanting to enter Europe at once, and in fact ready to do it by force, by forcing down the barriers, in a manner that of course is not acceptable to any country, the United States being an example of that. I remember as a child in the German refugee camps. Europe, by the way, had something like 7 million refugees from the communist system, from that part of the world, and Western and Northern Europe was not ready to keep them. it did not feel it could absorb them. It had to recover from the war. It didn't need all those people. And it asked for international assistance to, as it were, get rid of these people and get somebody else to absorb them. The United States, I recall, would give preference to those living in the American occupation zone. My parents and I were living in the British occupation zone. So for me, America was excluded right from the start as a possible destination. Countries like Sweden were excluded as destinations from those who were in Germany because they had accepted the refugees who had come by boat at the risk of their lives over from Latvia and Estonia. For one thing, real refugees do not leave their home happily or voluntarily. They are attached to their own home. They would like to make their life where they are, and they find it impossible to do so. So it's with much regret and heartache that the refugee leaves their home behind. And it's not an easy matter to look for a place where you are going to spend the rest of your natural days. In those days, America, for instance, would have screenings, very serious screenings of the refugees from the American zone, and according to the quotas and so on and so forth, in terms of whom they would admit. Well, what Europe is now doing is actually much more lax and much more open. People are being admitted by the thousands and by the tens of thousands because they physically simply land on Europe's shores. And of course, the tragedy is that some of them do not land, they drown in the Mediterranean. But the size of this influx is a technical problem, first of all, how to handle such a flow of refugees, and all at once. And I myself think that the international community, the United Nations refugee organization, the one that fed me when I was a child in the camps, they should be more active in seeking out the reasons for why is it that all of a sudden so many people are fleeing conflict zones. What are the causes of these conflicts, particularly in Syria and its environs? Are there any ways of calming down the fires, if you like, of conflict and violence that are lit both in the Middle East and in parts of Africa? These are serious international problems, not just European problems. But the mass of people who have arrived on European shores, the question is now to do the sort of screening and filtering that was done after the Second World War in a very serious way, to see whether these are people who truly wish to remain in Europe and integrate in various countries, where we must say Europe does not have a uniform level of prosperity. Some countries have much more generous social allowances and social support, and those are the ones whom they wish to reach. We are having a debate in Latvia about how many refugees we can manage to absorb as a small country that already suffered under serious loss of population of the indigenous population, to many going into exile, many being deported to Siberia, and the systematic Russification during the Soviet occupation. There's a debate about how many we can manage to receive and support with the kind of budget that we have. But we cannot compete, certainly, in the level of support that we can offer with Sweden or with Germany. And so that I suspect that when we do have refugees coming to Latvia, I mean, my personal hope is that some of them will choose to stay in that country and learn the language and integrate. Others will probably be looking for greener pastures elsewhere. And that means that countries like Britain, like Germany, and like Sweden are really faced with a serious influx of refugees who they must be integrated into society if the society is to survive with its if you like, its local values, its local characteristics, its customs, its laws intact, rather than being drastically changed by, as it were, when the Huns were invading Europe, and who clearly were coming in with completely different values from those that were existing in place at the time. It's a serious challenge. Clearly, people have different views on how to go about it and how to respond. And it is distracting international attention from the untenable situation in Ukraine. And I hope it will not make us forget about the problem in Ukraine, because that breach of international law, that breach of international treaties and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot just simply be swept under the carpet with the hope that, well, if we forget it, it will go away. It will not.
Well, and Secretary Albright, I've heard you say that the United States must do more in the migrant crisis, and I'd like to draw you out on that.
Well, I believe that fully, and let me just say, the European story, I think everything that the President has said is absolutely right. The mass of people, badly organized processing systems, the international community is not, the UNHCR should be going to the borders and at least helping with the processing part of it, or building camps or doing something. I think this is not just a problem for Greece, or so it's much larger, and we could talk more about that. But I have to say also, we have an issue, and I think one of the main issues here is something that you said. People want actually to live in the country where they were born. And I think we have to recognize that, and what it does is explain why, this is all circular, why we are dealing with the Russians to do something about Syria. Because unless people can live in Syria, this is going to keep going on as the major part. And it makes you realize that the kind of progression of problems, of how they are linked to each other. We are getting our eye off the ball on Ukraine because we've got all these other issues. But I do think the following thing. One of the problems that's going on in terms of the conflicts is the neighboring countries to Syria. So among the things that I did up in New York at CGI was have a meeting on Jordan. King Abdullah was there. And I have been to Jordan recently, and I have been to the Syrian camp. The Jordanians not only have a camp of Syrian refugees, but of Iraqi refugees and Palestinian refugees. So I was kind of, in this meeting, I was telling the story about being there and saying, you know, if all the refugees to the king that you have in Jordan were equivalent to American population, it would be as though we had 40 million refugees. And he said, no, 60 million. So we are having problems with 11 million undocumented workers. This is crazy. And I do think that the United States, we should be able to take, we are a huge country, and we have had refugees from a number of countries that are able to adapt. And I don't mean to make it sound self-serving. I don't have as complicated a story as the President has. But the bottom line is, I do think this country can do more. And all I can tell you is that when we came here, we had spent the war in England, and my father used to tell this story regularly, that when we were in England during the war, people would say, we're so sorry that your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here, and when are you going home? When we came to the United States, people said, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here, and when will you become a citizen? And my father said that was the thing that distinguished America. And America is built on immigrants. The Pope told us that. And so I do think that we could be doing more than taking 100,000 over 5 years. And if we expect other countries to lead or take their share, we have to do better than that. And what drives me crazy is is that there are those people here who are raising the fear factor, that these are Muslims and they're terrorists, and we're going to have all kinds of terrible incidents here. We do have a screening process. We know how to do this, and I believe the United States should do better.
Great. I'm going to open it up to all of you. I've got wonderful colleagues with mics, so just introduce yourself. And I've got 2 hands right up here in the front, and maybe we'll take a couple questions together just to get more folks in. Right here, Hans, and then yeah.
Hans Benendijk from SAIS. Madeleine, great to see you. Karen, I think you really raised a very important point when you talked about the new divisions within Europe as a result of this migration crisis. I was in Europe for the last couple of weeks, and I came away with the strong impression that that is beginning to have an impact on the unity of the alliance, Madeleine, that you talked about, the unity that was formed in Wales. I was in Warsaw, I was in Rome, and I was getting very emotional responses, both saying, our crisis is the crisis that faces the alliance. The other crisis doesn't matter so much. We don't believe it's vital. And so you see this division, and it's broad. So, I mean, we need to figure out how to try to reunify the alliance as the strategic concept did 5 years ago. As you look to the east, you can draw on 65 years of experience to how to deal with Russia. We don't have that experience dealing with the threats in the south. So I guess my question would be, how do we go about reunifying, and is there some way we can create a viable sort of NATO strategy for the south that draws to NATO's strong suit?
Yeah, and we'll just pull Harlan and come back.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Madam Secretary, you may remember when you were the chairman of the Council of Experts putting together the strategic concept. When the kickoff meeting, I teased you by asking the question, is NATO a relic or is it relevant? And I'd like to turn that around and ask, someone must have pre-guessed my question.
I think so.
Is the United States a relic or is it relevant? I put it in this context. For better or for worse, this administration is foundering. Things in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria are not going well. Putin, for the moment, is running circles around us, but I think he's found a new Afghanistan. And similarly in Europe, I don't see any constituency inside the United States that really is as keen as understanding that Europe is still the strategic center of gravity for us. And our domestic politics, as you point out, have gone crazy. I mean, Planned Parenthood cutting down, stopping the government, you have the election, and the new administration is not going to take over. When it takes over, it's going to be 6 months or a year before it has its feet on the ground. So what do we do in the interim when it looks like the Obama administration is foundering and it's going to take time for the new administration to come in? What are your interim steps to try to rally the alliance along the lines that Hans said? Because we need to use Warsaw, but I don't see Warsaw being used as an opportunity today to do the things that are necessary to reorient the alliance for the dangers that it's going to be facing.
These questions go together actually very well. So let me just say, when we, just to explain to people, on the 60th anniversary of NATO, what happened was that the leaders met in Strasbourg, Kiel. A new Secretary General came in, Rasmussen, and at the same time, the leaders decided that they wanted to have a look at a new strategic concept and that he should have a group of experts. So each country named an expert, and I was named by the US, and then Rasmussen decided to have the group of experts be only of 12 countries, automatically irritating 16 countries, and then he asked me to chair it. So, but what was interesting was trying to figure out in quite a different atmosphere what the role of NATO was. Was it a relic or relevant? And what was evident was that the lessons that NATO had learned and the crises that were out there, whether they had been in the Balkans or were in Afghanistan, provided lessons for NATO to, in fact, be relevant in the next decades and to be able to take up other issues in partnership with other organizations. And we discovered that NATO had more partners than it had members, and that the various issues that were out there, some of them that had to do with border conflicts, some of them in terms of some social and economic issues, that there was a way to adapt NATO to this, and that the partnerships, and it goes a little bit to the issues in the South, that the Mediterranean partnerships and the Arab League, and that it was possible to focus on other issues through this multiplicity of other organizations. Again, I think one of the hard parts, and I keep going through this in my own head, of do we always operate on the basis of false assumptions? I mean, we made some false assumption about the Russian Federation. Have we made some false assumptions in terms of where some of the conflicts are? And I think we always need to push and test ourselves on this. I do think, to your more point on this, Hans, I think that there has to be a way that the NATO Council is in fact able to discuss some of these divisions and why they exist. I have to say, and again, when I was in the government, I was always made responsible for every Central and Eastern European. In principals meetings, people would say, what about your Czechs? You know, so I do feel responsible at the moment in a way that I think it is really sad, is the only way to put it, disappointing that people in countries for whom we all fought all through the Cold War have forgotten that. How many Hungarians did we worry about? And I find it really horrible in terms of what's going on. I've had discussions with people who say to me, Madeleine, you forget your history. These were countries that were formed on the basis of self-determination and national identity. They care about their homogeneity. The world is not homogeneous anymore. And I think that with several tens of millions of international homeless, countries do have to have a way of absorbing. And I think that we need to have this be a discussion that is an EU-NATO discussion. Not easy, but I think we really have to do it. The United States is never going to be irrelevant. The issue is the following. I know President Clinton said it first, but I said it so often, we are the indispensable nation. There is nothing, however, in the definition of indispensable that says alone. Americans don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism. But all it means is partnerships, and I think that this is why these questions go together. The problems that we have now can only be dealt with by a multiplicity of organizations and a different way of looking and testing the assumptions. This is a very bad period, there's no question. And the linkages of the subjects, if Ukraine, one of the reasons that Putin is in Syria is because he wants attention off of Ukraine. That is part of the story. And I think we should be smart enough to be able to think in a number of different areas. And having discussions like this is so important because in a democracy, you have to explain this to the people. And I say the following things. Foreign policy is based a lot on how the people feel in a democracy. And we are exhausted from a bad war in Iraq. That was the biggest mistake that America's made in a very long time. And I think that's what's holding us back from really moving forward, but not irrelevant, just tired. And one more thing, I'm very bothered by what I call the Karzai effect. Americans gave up many lives and treasure for Afghanistan, and we do expect occasionally somebody to say thank you. He not only didn't say thank you, but blamed us for having done things wrong. So when you go to Congress or there's a political campaign, it's easy enough to say, why should we care about those people who never help us?
Did you want to comment on this?
I'd just like to mention that when the time came to decide on how to react to the invasion of Ukrainian territory and the annexation of Crimea, Europeans showed a surprising degree of unity. I think more so than had been expected in terms of having to react, at least on moral grounds, to make some sort of gesture short of military reaction, a gesture of disapproval of what was happening there. And the ability to adopt sanctions for countries, for many of whom have very close economic links with the Russian Federation. Quite a substantial dependency in terms of energy, quite substantial investments. For instance, Italy has huge investments of its companies in the Russian Federation. And yet Europe was able, in a pinch, under a crisis, to come together and to have a common decision. I do believe that NATO is somewhat in that same situation, and that all the flaring up of conflicts and difficulties in various parts of the world simultaneously should have the effect of galvanizing the alliance into more cohesive policies, into a better understanding of what needs to be done to make it more effective as an instrument of collective defense. Because it's become quite evident that the need for defense might arise for some of the countries in the alliance. And frankly, you never do know for whom the bell tolls, you see. And it is important to be prepared. I think NATO, from what I understand, has a feeling that among the members that they must be more active in having, for instance, territorial defense plans that really actually are that they are able to put into practice and that will be effective. I myself would like to hope that the Warsaw Summit will show some progress in that regard. In other words, an understanding that collective defense means precisely what it says, the ability to defend yourself. If should the need arise, one always hopes it wouldn't and won't, but should it arise, one should be ready.
So there's a hand by the fireplace I saw earlier to Sabadia. Yes, okay. And then, yeah. And I see you in the blue shirt, but there was also a gentleman right behind you I'd seen before you, so we'll take those two next. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Nelly Babayan from Transatlantic Academy, based at GMF.
Can you speak up, please?
Nelly Babayan from Transatlantic Academy, based at GMF. Madam Secretary, you rightly mentioned that U.S. often misunderstood Russia. And the same sentiment is actually present also in Russia, as they blame Americans and Europeans in misunderstanding the, quote, wide Russian soul. So my question would be, what would be your specific recommendations to the U.S. or maybe State Department in trying to understand Russia better? Thank you.
Okay. And then we'll just take one more question over there. Yeah.
Lawrence Lamhouse with SEIS. As a German, I have a pretty simple question. Where do you see Germany in all of this? Wouldn't you say that it's finally time for Germany to become actually active in foreign policy, which is for the last year has just refused to do actively? I'd like to have your response to that.
Okay. So President Vīķe-Freiberga, we'll start with you this time.
Well, Germany, I think, suffered for many decades of collective guilt. And there were partners in Europe who found this quite convenient, actually, because Germany would be paying the bill for much of the of what were the previous phases of the European Union. Germans have, I think, reacted to the terrible debacle that Hitler led them into by wishing to simply forget all about militarism, about defense. We can remember the groups of even terrorists who were complaining and militating against the militarization of Germany, against its ability to become a military power again. And frankly, those countries that fought against Germany in the Second World War, I think for a long time were leery too of seeing Germany become too much of a military force. One wanted to see a reformed Germany, a democratic Germany being born before seeing a Germany that was well armed and ready to intervene. My personal feeling is that the time has come, that they're now ripe for it. And remains to be seen how the population responds to the current situation. I have been told that there are a lot of Putin-Verständer in Germany. People who are very sympathetic to Mr. Putin. I think he's just wonderful, you see. And that we should continue doing business with him because it's a big market and it would be very profitable. And the devil take the hindmost for the countries that that are happening to be the direct neighbors and that might be threatened by this country. I find that attitude a bit short-sighted. I don't think it shows a sufficient understanding of what it means to tolerate behavior that in the end is completely against the principles that your own country has been trying to build up painfully over the last 6 decades or so. But these divisions, of course, in Europe, they go back to the 19th century. The monarchists against the revolutionaries, the left wing against the right wing. I think that these divisions are even more pronounced in Europe than the divisions between Democrats and Republicans here in the United States. There are ideological differences in Europe, and until now, they have been accommodated in a democratic process. This has been the answer to stopping wars, civil wars, stopping wars between countries. But as I say, it's like tending a flower. You cannot take it for granted. And you cannot take for granted the progress that has been made in terms of public understanding of public understanding of democracy. Many people in Russia will tell you, quite frankly, that they think democracy is not made for Russians. It's not for them. They need a strong hand. They need a father figure to lead them. You may call that wish infantile, and it may be so, but if it's present, then the population is going to act accordingly, and its leaders are going to take advantage of the thing. There are also many people in the European Union who feel the need for a paternalistic sort of somebody who will come and solve all the problems. Somebody whom I saw, one of your candidates for the presidency, who said, I will do this, and I will do that, and I will toss them out, and I will build a fence, and I will do this. I by myself, me, I will do it, and you will just sort of sit back, relax, and I'll take care of you. Unfortunately, life is not like that. And some people would wish it to be, but it's not.
I think that where you ended is where I will begin, which is basically that we are all countries are going through some kind of psychological depression in terms of life being awfully complicated and trying to figure out how to make it work. I do think there are various forces to blame for this. Some is technology in many different ways that has isolated all of us so that people get their own sources of information, basically listening to only what they already agree with, which, by the way, I do not do. I listen to Rush Limbaugh as I drive in Washington. You might wish to stay away from me because I get dangerous in this. But the bottom line is I do think it's important to listen to what you disagree with. And what's happening now is more and more kind of me. I'm going to believe what I believe. And I think that there are huge divisions within all our countries that are dangerous. I happen to think also nationalism is a very dangerous force. It is one thing to be patriotic. It's another, and there had become kind of a facelessness to globalization and the European Union, and people didn't know who they were. So there began to be kind of identifying with your own whatever, language or religion, which is fine, unless, of course, you hate the people that live next door. And so the nationalist trend here, I think, is very, very dangerous and is divisive in so many different ways. In terms of understanding the Russian soul, I always called it the Slavic soul, since I have one. But basically, I think it's endlessly fascinating country that throughout its whole history has been divided between Slavophiles and Westernizers, those who really, the Slavophiles who believe that it's truly different, and the Westernizers, gone from Peter the Great, that really began to look at different ways. This goes on, still there. I think that there is a sense of disappointment that my man with the Bangladesh with missiles, of not having superpower status anymore and not being able to adjust themselves to that, a real identity crisis. But the most important thing a diplomat has to do is put yourself into the shoes of the other person. And that is where I think the only way that we will understand each other is to really try that. Not easy, believe me, but I think that's a very important part. I do think that Germany needs to take a more responsible role. It's been a free rider on some aspects of the collective security system, and I think that in some ways the guilt factor has been used by those who don't want to do anything. And so, but the question is how much and who. But I do think the Germans need to have a greater part, and not everything has to be by putting boots on the ground. The way that our system works now, there are so many parts that need to be done. It goes back a little bit to the previous question in terms of helping on some of the social and economic issues, also helping when there are questions that have to do with certain kinds of, like getting rid of chemical weapons or a variety of issues, but much more commensurate with their power and really taking a responsibility. What I think is one of the saddest things that I saw in Europe, even before the migration, is the absolute snobbishness, if I apologize for this, of the Northern Europeans towards the Southern Europeans. And what was already evident in the financial crisis. And the Germans, to a great extent, were lecturing everybody about where to save money. Now they've got Volkswagen. So I think somebody needs to read. Roger Cohen wrote a brilliant piece about this, that countries need to examine their souls about what do we all really stand for.
Great. Now we're coming low on time, and I'm going to pull the 3 hands that were up last time and apologize to the rest of you. But there's one here in the blue shirt, and we'll come over to you and then over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Lei Xuan with the BBC Chinese. So as some traditional European allies joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, would you worry about that the growing economic power of China will pose a threat to the Transatlantic partnership? And second question, how would you comment to the relation between U.S. and China compared to the days when you were in office?
Okay. And everyone has to just ask one question. That was quite clever. You slipped in 2. Yeah, please.
I'm Shraib Rahim from Rumsfeld Fellowship, and I'm from Afghanistan. So the first thing I'd like to say is thank you.
You were listening.
Afghanistan has been a major beneficiary of this transatlantic relationship over the past decade. My personal career and education has been a direct result of the efforts by ISAF and NATO and the United States. So next year we have the Warsaw Summit, which is Chicago 2.0, which is a commitment to go back and review the commitments to the security sector of Afghanistan for the next 5 years. So I guess my question would be, as an Afghan, what would we be expecting, taking into consideration the changing nature of global and the geopolitical changes that is happening in Eastern Europe? So what is it that Afghanistan should be expecting in the Warsaw Summit next year?
And just if you can pass the mic over one, that'd be great.
Jonas Plesner with the Embassy of Denmark. Thanks to the whole panel for being such strong pillars of the transatlantic relationship. My question was to you, Madam Secretary. You alluded to UNHCR and a sort of bigger role in Europe, and said you could elaborate on that during the question and answer. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, great. And I am going to break my own rule and let you have the last word. Actually, we have a very distinguished, oops, can you bring the mic up for one last question?
My name is Marcy Reese. I just returned from being U.S. Ambassador in Bulgaria. And I can't resist bringing up the situation in the Balkans. You, Madam President, talked about propaganda and soft power and pressures that people are feeling, rather extraordinary pressure. So does this mean that it's time to push a little harder on closer integration of the countries in the Balkans? And what do you do about people who do reinvent the facts?
So we've got China, Afghanistan, UNHCR, and the Balkans.
Okay.
Who wants to start?
I think you should.
Well, let me start with UNHCR because I was just with Antonio Gutierrez and we were talking about all this. I do think that UNHCR has been an incredible part of the United Nations system and has developed a way of trying to operate in a variety of different places, whether it's in the refugee camps, but there is a method. And what I have found interesting is I know that there's been more UNHCR action that has been evident, at least that's what Mr. Gutierrez says, but I do think that part of the issue here is the overwhelming aspect of people coming, and that the UNHCR does have mechanisms whereby at least they could put some law and order into it. And I have, for the last 3 days up in New York, had a variety of panels on the humanitarian issue, one with David Miliband from the International Rescue Committee. And I finally said to the audience, just imagine what it is like to have walked to get to some place, then paid a lot of money to some smuggler, then practically drowned getting there, then getting someplace and being told go away. I think, you know, the thing that I keep going over in my own head, we are all constructed exactly the same way. When you're hot, you're hot. And when you're hungry, and I just find it hard to believe that people are being treated like animals. And so the bottom line is I think UNHCR could do more. It could create some processing centers. We know how to build camps. There are ways to do that. So I do think this is not just a Greek problem or just a German problem. It really is an international one. So for that part. I do think on the China issue, let me just say I think the United States made a huge mistake in being opposed to the Asian Bank. And there was every reason for us to be a part of it and have welcomed it, and it was a mistake, and it was shown as a mistake. So how is the relationship different? So let me just say, one of the things, believe it or not, when I was first at the UN, the Chinese never wanted to participate in any discussion unless, of course, it had something to do with interference in domestic affairs. But the Chinese perm rep really didn't participate much. And one of the things that happens, you're up there in the Security Council and you spend days with the same people and you really get to be good friends. So I finally gave the Chinese perm rep a little blue ball so he could practice raising his hand to be a part of the discussion. Because China as a permanent member, and we wanted to have them be a part of things. There was an effort that I also made to try to get, one of the things, as ambassador, you know this, you get talking points, and so my talking points were always the same. Chen Chi-chen was the foreign minister of China at the time. His talking points were always the same. And so I said, let me give you my talking points. Why don't you give me yours? And why don't we have a strategic discussion? I wanted China to be a part of what was going on so that we could understand how the system worked in terms of having more helping in the governance. So slowly but surely, the Chinese have gotten to be a part of it. I think that they're clearly a very complicated relationship, but the meeting with Xi Jinping was really fast. If you look at the takeout, they did lots and lots of things. The climate change, a real example of international cooperation. I think some of the issues that came out on the table were the kind that had to be, we have disagreements with China, there's no question. And people are very worried about what's going on in the South China Sea. But there clearly is more of a way of China being part of the system, and them offering more peacekeepers is a very good idea. So I think that is a very good, the bulk.
Great. So that leaves Afghanistan and the Balkans for you, Madam President.
Well, Afghanistan, like any other country that's been helped, has a responsibility, of course, to do its share of necessary changes to ensure that whatever caused its problems at the time would not be perpetuated. In that sense, it's very disappointing, the latest news we have about the Taliban having again conquered an important city. And the question then is, where do the Afghan people themselves, where do they stand? How ready are they to enter the modern world, and how unready they are to do so? That's one of the problems. I'd like to say a few words about the ambassador's question. I think it's a fundamental one, and Madam Secretary alluded to that as well, about our sources of information. We are flooded with information in this information age, but we have absolutely no means of filtering it on our own without somebody somewhere somehow telling us, oh, this corresponds to the actual facts on the ground, and this does not. But unless you've been on the ground there yourself, or unless you trust your source of information, you're really quite helpless. And I think that is a problem of the modern world. And I was chairing a group that submitted a report on plurality and freedom of media in the European Union. And I think the plurality of sources is one hope, at least, in terms of sources of information. Any country that has total control of the media and has only one version of the facts available, as is the case in Russia, I think it's going down the wrong way. Any country that puts up firewalls for its internet is not really putting the solid foundations that it should for its future. But children will have to be educated from an early age to understand that the same fact can be interpreted in very different ways. We can have different narratives. And to try and at the same time not lose their identity, because I think this is this uniformization. Everybody is running around in jeans and T-shirts and in American running shoes everywhere instead of their national costumes. But they also may feel faceless and anonymous and suffer from what Durkheim way back when he founded sociology called anomie, rootlessness, a sense of not belonging. So people need a sense of rooting themselves in their culture, in their religion, in their locality. But hatred is something that has no place in that. Love of your own country and love of your forests and woods and or your deserts is perfectly fine. Hatred of your enemy or inventing enemies or choosing somebody to hate, frankly, that is not to help. To have different versions of what happened, to understand the complexity of history, to know that the Second World War, for instance, the way it's told in North America, doesn't say a thing about what happened in Eastern Europe. It's both Canadian and American versions. I was struck when I came to this continent after living in North Africa and after living in refugee camps in Germany. I was amazed how accounts of the Second World War in America stop on D-Day and on the armistice. They don't really tell very much about the Eastern Front at all and what happened. The world is getting increasingly complex. The human mind is limited in its capacity to process information. I think we're faced there for democracy with a really serious challenge. And our educational systems are also faced with a very serious challenge. Many of them play lip service to teaching critical thinking. Having been a professor for many decades in Canada, I know that there's nothing more unnatural to the human mind than critical thinking. The natural way for humans is to be uncritical and to go with the stream and to follow everybody else. So that we have to go against human nature and start teaching children from a very young age to be as rational as they possibly can and to evaluate things. And that, to me, as well as the crisis of capitalism, which I think is in difficulty, to me these are the biggest challenges of the future. Not to mention climate warming, water, you name it, but the human mind and its limited capacity to process information.
President Vīķe-Freiberga, Secretary Albright, you clearly are two bright stars in our transatlantic firmament. Please join me in thanking them both.